Okay, so the title of my talk is How Security and Safety Will Converge in the IoT World. A lot of people have started thinking about how you would do standards for security in IoT, and we learned something last year which suggests that standards may come from a different direction entirely. Because the European Union regulates the safety of all sorts of devices. There's over a dozen different verticals with rich, deep regulatory regimes that have evolved over many decades. And last year, the European Union asked two colleagues and me, Aaron Leverett and Richard Clayton and me, to do a research project to examine what the Internet of Things would mean for their regulatory infrastructure. Their obvious concern is that once you get software everywhere, safety and security get entangled. So what happens, for example, to the safety of motor cars once every car is basically a mobile phone with an engine and wheels attached? Another interesting aspect when you look at this in a European scale is that safety and security are the same in the languages spoken by most EU citizens. Sicurezza, seguridad, sûreté, Sicherheit, and so on. And so what's going to happen, not just from the point of view of the security world, but from the point of view of safety regulators when people have to cope with this? Now, by way of background, markets do safety in some industries better than others. Planes are safer than medical devices because plane crashes are public and they kill rich white people and they get reported on the front page of the newspaper and they affect company share prices, so people care. People who die from medical accidents tend to be older or poorer or whatever and die unshriven. Cars are one of the examples that we looked at, and cars were absolutely dreadful for the first 70 or 80 years of the motor industry's existence, until a campaigner, Ralph Nader, wrote a book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which so energized the American public that they set up the National Highways Transportation Safety Administration and started setting standards, doing tests and reporting on car safety. In the European Union, we had a different trajectory, but we've got a bunch of general laws such as the Product Liability Directive, which says you can't click away liability for bad things that cause death or injury, and the Framework Directive on Type Approval, which is what regulates the approval of cars for Europe's roads. And there's over 20 European Union agencies, plus some other agencies as well, involved in this. So it is a big, entrenched bureaucratic apparatus. So what does security hold? Well, this is from 2010, from the Car Shark paper at Auckland. Let's see if I can actually cause the video to play.
And we'll be applying your brakes shortly.
This car's being hacked remotely.
Right about now. Ooh. Yeah, that worked. Oh, is he going to go to the wall?
So the guy in there, I spoke to him at the conference. He was test driving that car on a disused airfield near Seattle. And the guy with the walkie-talkie was his thesis advisor who had hacked the car and pressed the brake button. And the student said that was the most terrifying thing he'd ever done in his life, much worse than scuba diving and cave diving and stuff like that. But you can imagine how creepy it can be if you're driving along and somebody else can control your brakes. That didn't get much industry attention, but what did was 2 years ago when a couple of guys, Charlie Miller and Chris Vereshak, hijacked a Jeep Cherokee by using the OnStar radio system in the car itself. So instead of having to hack into the diagnostic port in the under the car's glove box, all they needed was the car's IP address. And so they managed to take over a Jeep with a volunteer journalist in it and slow it down so that it was driving at 20 miles an hour on the freeway with the big trucks going along honking hard behind it. And eventually they ran it off the road into a ditch. And because this was visual, it got on the front pages of the papers, it got in the news, people suddenly cared. And that cost Chrysler billions because all of a sudden they had to recall over 1 million vehicles for a software fix. So this is moving up the agenda. Here's another example of what happens when cars get hacked. Anybody recognize the guy on the left? This is the former CEO of Volkswagen who put evil software in his company's cars. You can see on the right what happened to his share price when he got caught, and his board of directors gave him the boot. So the attackers are not just outsiders, they can be in the supply chain as well. And in fact, this is an industry with pervasive mistrust. Ford tried to source a series of components for one of its cars with a contractual term that the suppliers would escrow the source code of all the components, and they simply didn't find any takers. So one of the problems with testing cars is that nobody knows all the software that goes in it. Bosch supplies this, Magna supplies this, Volkswagen supplies this, and neither gets to look at each other's source code. Another issue that's coming along is scaling, because although your traditional car makers are moving to autonomy by adding one feature after another, adaptive cruise control, automatic emergency braking, and so on, you've got challengers like Google and Tesla who are moving faster and trying to get to autopilot more or less in one leap. And the software that's underlying this is also interesting because Tesla has already moved to regular software upgrades. When they made autopilot available, for example, that was just a software upgrade for which you paid $5,000. And all of a sudden your car could kind of drive itself on the motorway. Other vendors have said that they will be doing regular over-the-air software updates by about 2 years from now. And because you've got a mutually mistrustful industry with components sourced from companies that basically aren't prepared to share secrets with each other, testing is a real big problem. You can buy test rigs for cars, but they're put together by almost a monopolist company. You'd have to sign an awful lot of NDAs to compete with them, and it is tiresome, it is expensive, and the lab cars, as they're called, tend to be recycled quickly because of cost. Here's another example of the Internet of Things. Can anybody spot the CPU in this picture? This is the intensive therapy unit at the hospital in Swansea. And as you can see, there's lots and lots and lots of CPUs. And as a result, there are lots and lots and lots of accidents. We have a house guest staying at the moment who broke both of his legs in a motorcycle accident 2 years ago, and he almost got killed, not in Swansea, in Southampton, when a nurse was about to give him 150 milligrams of morphine instead of 30. Why? Because of basically because of user interface problems. Here, for example, are all the syringe pumps or infusion pumps that you see in Swansea. As you can see, all the UX is different everywhere. And even where you've got a device which is supposedly the same thing, Bodyguard 545, on this instance, it's a 5 to increase the dose and a 0 to decrease it. And there it's a 2 to increase the dose and a 0 to decrease it. And so twice a year, a new cohort of nurses start in every NHS hospital, and they see half a dozen different types of pump from different vendors, some of which they may have seen before. They don't have to practice individually with each pump, as an airline pilot would with a new plane, and accidents happen. What can you do about that? Well, the medical device directives are now being revised. And this is a big deal because my friend Harold Thimbleby, who's a professor in Swansea and has looked at this, has gathered evidence to show that in the UK, hospital safety usability failures kill about the same number of people as road traffic accidents. And here the priority is to get regulators to do post-approval studies and adverse event reporting rather than just pre-market approval, which is something you have in common with cars. At present, you do car safety by smashing 200 prototypes against the wall before you start manufacturing the thing, and then you hope it's good for the next 40 years. Similarly with medical devices. As we move to a world of pervasive software which gets updated, you have to start looking at safety throughout the whole life cycle, and you have to start looking at stuff that people didn't look at before, such as the user interface. And security is going to help to drive this, because up until now, if you get killed by a syringe pump, if my mate Marky had been killed a year ago in Southampton, probably nobody would have noticed because he was pretty sick at the time. But if they had done, it would have been the nurse's fault. People seem to be good with that. But attacks are very much harder to ignore. And now that you're seeing attacks on medical devices, we're starting to see serious product recalls. In 2015, a Wi-Fi hack on the Hospira Simbe confusion pump led the FDA to blacklist it and order a recall, despite the fact that there were over 200 devices on the market which were unsafe, which the FDA had refused to recall. But once you start talking about adversarial action, people get creeped out, regulators panic and stuff gets recalled. Just recently, almost 500,000 pacemakers, most of them in the USA, but some here in the UK have been recalled because somebody found a vulnerability. And this causes all sorts of problems because when you do software upgrades, you break certification, and there are whole stories around that as well. But what this is telling us is that you need a proper safety and security life cycle for medical devices, just like you need it for cars. The third vertical that we looked at was electrotechnical equipment, electricity substations, smart meters, everything in between. And with substations, you tend to have a 40-year life cycle, and the thing is built using protocols, DNP3, that don't support authentication, just like CAN bus in cars. It's very difficult to retrofit anything because of the huge inertia in the industry and the time it takes to do any standards. And the fact that you've got an industry that grew up on private networks and suddenly uses IP networks because they're cheaper means that all of a sudden anybody who knows the IP address of a sensor can read it, and anybody who knows the IP address of an actuator can activate it. And the smart operator here was some guys in British Columbia who realized that the only way to do a practical fix in a short period of time was to reperimeterize. And they set up a company, Belden, which does specialized firewalls that understand protocols like DNP3 and which will sit at the boundary of your substation and not let bad things in from the internet. BP alone has over 5,000 of those, and they sold the company and made a lot of money. So that can work in some circumstances, but it can't work with cars because a modern car might have as many as 10 different RF interfaces, and not all of these are under the control of the OEM. Right? So even things like your tire pressure sensors and your mobile phone Bluetooth pairing and so on can be used and have been demonstrated as being capable of being used for attacks. So that's the big challenge. You could establish non-IT industries using a static approach with pre-market testing and standards that take 40 years to change. And once you get malicious adversaries looking at stuff that's online, then bugs can be scaled into attacks and can be scaled up to stuff that you have to worry about, right? If you have got a vulnerability in a car that could allow somebody to cause 1 million cars to crash at once, that is a strategic threat. And then you need a dynamic approach with patching as in IT, and the time constant's typically a month. What our customers in the European Union were worried about is how on earth you make this work within the sprawling bureaucracy of the European Union. What sort of changes are needed? The sort of questions you have to ask: who will investigate incidents and to whom will they be reported? How do you scale all this up? There's 500,000 serious road traffic accidents in Europe every year. You can't bring in a specialist expert witness every time. How do you automate it? What do you do about responsible disclosure? Right, this is a real problem with the car industry, which usually prefers to keep mum and sue people who blab. How do you bring safety engineers and security engineers together? You know, we read different books, we speak different languages, we publish in different venues, although some industry people are starting to work on that. Are all these 20 agencies in Brussels that work on car safety each going to need somebody who's done a PhD with us on their staff? Well, there aren't enough such people around, and industry offers them more money. But what are you going to do about that? How do you prevent abusive lock-in? So we ended up with a number of policy recommendations requiring vendors to self-certify for the CE mark that they put on products, that the products can be patched if need be. And in fact, it turns out that we've already got international standards for secure development lifecycle. Anybody who certifies an online and programmable product as CE, in other words, complying with all applicable safety standards, if it can't be remotely patched, is making a false statement, and the customs men at Rotterdam should, send those containers back to China. So there are some things you could do with existing rules if they were enforced. we suggested creating a European security engineering agency to support policymakers and extending the product liability directive to services as well. And then you need to do various stuff around the Network and Information Security Directive to ensure that security breaches don't just get reported to GCHQ, but to your car regulator, your medical device regulator, vendors and so on who can actually do something about it. Here's the punchline. We realized this after we had delivered the report, and last December we were sitting thinking about this at a meeting in Dargstuhl, and we said, well, what's the research takeaway from this? We realized this. With phones and laptops, you patch them monthly, but they become obsolete quickly because Android doesn't want to support 100 different models. That's one type of secure object we make, the frequently patched device that's almost a consumable. And the second type of device is cars and medical devices which you test to death before release, and you don't connect them to the internet and you almost never patch them. Right? And what happens when an unstoppable cannonball meets an immovable post? Well, you have to start revising your philosophical assumptions. What's going to happen to support costs now that we're going to start to patch cars? And since I've started talking about this last December, there has been a huge amount of interest from affected industries. I got invited to talk at Bosch's annual engineering conference back in June, for example, and later when I was talking at Weiss in San Diego, the security VP from Qualcomm comes up and he says, yeah, this is exactly the problem we've got to. He said, you know how many versions of our baseband we're having to keep in patch support for various phone companies who buy our chips? He said, 105. So even among apparently consumable, non-durable objects like phones, the fan-out, the number of different versions of the software that you've got is now starting to cause a real headache. Once the embedded phones in cars are 20 years old, Qualcomm's going to have a real headache. And the tier ones, people like Bosch and Magna and so on, they're going to have absolutely astronomical costs. I'll skip through this quickly. Here's my Nexus 5X. Bought it last year. Google announced a few weeks ago they're going to stop patch support in September 2018, right? A £700 device, 3-year lifetime. Why? Because Larry and Sergey don't have enough money to support more than 3 or 4 versions of Android, right? When this world hits the world of companies like Volkswagen and Mercedes, there's a problem. Oh, and this is from the work we do at the Cambridge Cybercrime Centre on security of Android, on what happens if the patch cycle isn't managed aggressively enough. And as you can see, most of the time, most of the devices out there are not secure. So what do you do about this? Well, I heard a large luxury car maker's guy saying that ideally they would like to basically scrap cars after 6 years or so. But there's a small problem in that vehicle lifetimes have doubled in the last 40 years. And a typical car, when it's scrapped in the UK, is now almost 15 years old. And the next problem is that if you buy a large luxury German car, the embedded carbon cost is about 30 tons, which is a bit more than its lifetime fuel burn. So if you reduce the lifetime by 2/3, you can do the math with David Mackay's book, and you'll conclude that CO2 emissions from road transport might approximately double. So we can't really see the policymakers buying that one. And then if you've ever been in somewhere like Nairobi, you'll know that all the cars are about 30 years old. And who's going to patch 30-year-old cars? Once at age 20, they've retired from service in the UK and been put on a boat to Mombasa. How do you do the long tail if that suddenly starts being a software maintenance problem? Is there any running software out there, except possibly LaTeX, that's still going 40 years after it was first written? How do we do this? Especially if it's heterogeneous stuff with 100 different CPUs from 20 different vendors written in 15 different programming languages with 30 different tool chains. How on earth do you support that? So here's the implications for R&D. If you have to support 20-year patching, which perhaps the EU might eventually mandate, you need a more stable and powerful tool chain. And the world of crypto teaches us how complex this can be with all the timing and other things that come up with TLS every year. Cars teach how do you sustain all the test environments. They can be expensive, they can be diverse. There's also an issue of how you maintain the skilled staff. Go and read the articles on the Mars Voyager program, which has been kept alive by a dozen engineers, most in the 70s and 80s, you know, working as volunteers, living off their pensions because they're the only guys who know that stuff. Can you run a car industry that way? It's not a labor of love, it's a business. How do you do it? Control systems teach, can you put in small tweaks to the architecture, like control points where you can put a firewall, which limit what you have to patch? Well, that would be nice, but how do you go about doing it? How do you incentivize designers and architects of products to go that way? Android teaches, how do you motivate OEMs to patch products they no longer sell? Do you have to use the big stick of legislation, or can you do something cleverer? Could you appeal to the self-interest of the component vendors who are the main beneficiaries of extended vehicle lifetime? Implications for research and teaching. Well, since this past academic year, I've been teaching safety and security engineering in the same course to first-year undergrads. And when I told the guys at Bosch, they were delighted about this because they've just put their safety and security engineering practices together into one profession within the company. It's an interesting thing to do, but it's non-trivial. How can you go about making the tool chain sustainable? We've been doing various things, for example, on the security front, trying to see to it that people writing crypto code can use annotations to tell the compiler that, yes, I really do want this loop to execute in constant time, so please don't optimize away these funny instructions that you don't quite understand. There's lots of possibilities for doing things like that, but there isn't time here to even start talking about that. But ways for programmers to communicate and document intent might help, and there have been other talks at this conference which have touched on that general theme. So here's the takeaway message. If the durable goods that we're designing today are still working in 2037, then things are going to have to change. Now, computer science is about managing complexity, right? It's about helping people to roll the stone a little bit further up the complexity mountain before you can go no further or fall off. And the history goes through Fortran and COBOL and Pascal and types and objects, and then tools like Git and Jenkins and Coverity and all the rest of it. All of these enable you to manage bigger, more complex projects. And I think that when you sit down and think about what's involved in maintaining security and safety patch support for a motor vehicle for 20 or 30 years, that's an interesting enough use case that it can help us try and work out what else will be needed for sustainable computing once we have software in just about everything. For more, our paper on the standardization and certification of the Internet of Things is the top link on my webpage, and there's also our blog. So that's where I think much of the interesting research may come from in this neck of the woods over the next 10 or 20 years. Thanks.